Erik Linthorst is the director of the award-winning documentary film Autistic-Like, Graham's Story. He's the father of Graham. The film, an official selection of 8 U.S. film festivals, has been featured on Good Morning America, Health, the documentary channel, and was the subject of a front-page article in the Atlantic magazine online. Erik was an invited presenter at the 2009 World Forum on Early Care and Education in Belfast, Ireland. So we're very, very pleased and honored to have Erik with us. Thank you.
Thank you. So about 5 years ago, my wife and I had our first child, Graham, and his development was pretty much square on for the first year or so. He sat up on time, he said his first words on time, he crawled on time, he walked on time. And in fact, everything was so right on with his development that we didn't really notice the few things he wasn't doing. He wasn't playing with toys and he wasn't really gesturing. But what really got our attention was he developed a couple of odd habits, one of which was that he became very fascinated with patterns and lines on the floor. And he would crawl back and forth along a line that he found. At first he'd do it a few times and then he'd grow tired of it, but it grew and grew to the point where he was spending about 80% of his awake time crawling back and forth on lines. And the other thing that he did, which was a little outside of what we had seen with our friends' children, was that he liked to spin wheels. And I thought that he just really liked trucks, but he would always take the truck and flip it over, and then he'd spin the wheel and kind of get lost in that. So our story sort of started out very sort of typical of a family headed towards an autism diagnosis. We saw concerning signs. Then Graham began to plateau in his development and even regress. My wife and I took Graham to our pediatrician. And as I've learned talking to other parents is very common and unfortunate, our pediatrician told us, let's just watch this. A lot of kids have quirks. He's too young to diagnose. He was 1.5, and basically sent us home. Fortunately, my wife and I decided that we wanted to investigate this and rule out anything that needed to be ruled out. And we called our local regional center, the Harbor Regional Center, and they sent a pediatric occupational therapist to our house to assess Graham. And while they weren't there to diagnose, the counselor who came, turned to me during the assessment process and said, "I know what you're thinking. This is severe autism." And I looked back at her and said, "Actually, I wasn't thinking that, but you're obviously thinking that, so now I'm thinking that." We then had an assessment with the regional center psychologist, and in about a half an hour, because the pattern on the floor of the room he was diagnosing us in happened to be particularly interesting to Graham, we had no problem getting a diagnosis. But that's where the sort of typical story ends. I started doing a little bit of my own research. The way that I process things and the way that I was processing my grief over the diagnosis was to try to understand it. And the more that research I did, the more I began to think, actually, I don't think he's autistic. I actually don't think he is, unless the spectrum is so wide that sort of like any kid with a bad case of the hiccups could be placed there. And so I started to ask some questions, and I started to investigate this, and we found our way to a developmental pediatrician who did a thorough assessment of Graham and said, so here's your dilemma. I don't think your child has autism. However, if I say that formally, he will lose all of his services. Your child needs services. So here we are. He has autistic-like behaviors that are caused by his sensory system being in a state of disarray. So I can, with good conscience, give him an autism diagnosis because, look, all I have to go on is this clinical definition written in this diagnostic manual. Delays in this and this and this. I can make that argument, and I can give you your diagnosis. So I started to ask around other parents, and what I found was that just in our neighborhood alone, in Manhattan Beach, there were dozens of other families going through the same thing. And in fact, there was this whole kind of like parent network that knew the doctor to go to get the diagnosis that you needed, to get the services you needed. Don't go to doctor this, you won't get an autism diagnosis. Go to doctor that, you'll get your autism diagnosis and you'll get your services. Oh, it doesn't really matter if your child has or doesn't have autism. These are just labels. What we're trying to do is get kids services. That was news to me. I thought diagnoses were supposed to mean that this child has this disorder, and then it puts you down a treatment pathway. So my wife and I and our son got sent down this very confusing pathway, and I spent the next year trying to make sense out of it. And the net result was that when I sort of figured it out for us, what worked, what I thought Graham actually had, what was the appropriate treatment, I thought I wanted to share this information with other parents who might be going through the same thing. So I decided to make a documentary film about our journey called Autistic-Like Graham's Story. And we've spent the last year traveling around with the film and presenting it at various forums. It's available out in the lobby. It's also available on my website, autistic-like.com. And I'm happy, after everybody's had a chance to speak, to answer any questions you have about it. So feel free to ask me during the panel or afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erik. I think it makes us all think about the labels that we give